The most powerful Nazis didn't die in glory. They didn't fall on the battlefield like the heroes they imagined themselves to be. They didn't receive honor, mercy, or remembrance. They died in fear. They died by poison hidden in teeth. They died in underground bunkers, prison cells, and locked rooms alone, defeated and desperate. This is not a story of their rise. This is the story of how absolute power collapsed into absolute terror. In the final days of the Third Reich, the empire that promised 1,000 years was already rotting from the inside. The banners still hung from shattered buildings. The propaganda still echoed on radios. But behind the slogans, behind the uniforms, behind the salutes, panic had taken over. By 1945, Nazi Germany was surrounded, bombed, and bleeding. Allied forces closed in from every direction. Cities born at railways lay twisted. Communications collapsed, and the men who once controlled Europe now found themselves trapped by the very violence they had unleashed. They had ruled through fear. Now fear ruled them. Deep beneath Berlin, in a concrete bunker buried under rubble, Adolf Hitler waited for the end. Above him, the city was being torn apart by Soviet artillery. Each explosion shook the walls. Each hour brought the enemy closer. The man who once commanded millions of soldiers now commanded only silence, paranoia, and a loaded pistol. This was the fate of Nazi power. Not triumph, but hiding underground like hunted animals. Hitler knew the truth long before the world did. There would be no escape, no rescue, no final speech to cheering crowds. Only a choice, capture or death. And to a man obsessed with control, capture was unthinkable. Elsewhere, other Nazi leaders faced the same realization. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS and the Holocaust, ran from his own identity. The man who built a system of camps and executions shaved his mustache, wore civilian clothes, and tried to disappear into the chaos of a defeated nation. He carried no army, no guards, only a single cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth. Last silent weapon. Joseph Goebbels, the master of propaganda, still spoke of loyalty and sacrifice, even as everything collapsed around him. Words had been his greatest weapon, but now they meant nothing. The crowds were gone. The radios fell silent, and inside the bunker, surrounded by poison and despair, his devotion would turn into one of the most horrifying acts of the entire war. Hermann Hu, Rhine once second only to Hitler himself, sat in a prison cell, awaiting judgment. The man who lived in luxury, dressed in metals and silk, now faced a rope. Yet even at the edge of justice, he would choose his own ending. The gallows were the final act of defiance, and Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, forgotten by the world, would live long enough to see the Nazi dream reduced to ash. Decades later, his death would raise questions that still haunt historians. These men once believed themselves untouchable. They believed history would remember them as conquerors. They believed fear would protect them forever. They were wrong. As the Third Reich collapsed, the illusion of strength vanished. Power did not save them. Loyalty did not save them. Ideology did not save them. When the moment came, each of them faced the same truth alone, stripped of titles and armies. No cheering crowds. No heroic endings. Only poison, bullets, fire, and prison walls. This is the part of history Nazi propaganda never showed. The ending they never planned for. The moment when terror turned inward. Because in the end, the regime built on death could not escape death itself. And what followed were some of the most shocking, disturbing, and ironic endings in modern history, proof that even the most feared men on earth could not outrun justice, fear, or their own downfall. This is how Nazi leaders really met their end. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was finished. Not defeated in theory, not weakened. Finished. The Third Reich once, stretching from France to the gates of Moscow, is now collapsing inward like a burning star. Allied armies closed in from every direction, tightening a noose that could not be escaped. From the west came American, British, and Canadian forces, crossing the Rhine and tearing through what remained of Germany's defenses. From the east came the Red Army, advancing relentlessly after years of brutal warfare. Berlin, the heart of Hitler's empire, was surrounded. There would be no miracle, no last-minute reversal, no secret weapon to save them. The war was over. Everyone knew it, especially the men at the top. German cities lay in ruins. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, reduced to ash by relentless bombing. Railways were destroyed. Flugwagen factories stood silent. The Luftwaffe no longer ruled the skies. German soldiers surrendered by the thousands, throwing away uniforms that once symbolized power. The Nazi state, built on intimidation and spectacle, was now a broken shell. Inside Germany, panic spread faster than truth. Civilians fled westward to avoid the advancing Soviets. Refugees filled the roads. Food shortages worsened. Order collapsed. The promises of victory made for years through propaganda dissolved overnight, and at the center of it all stood a leadership frozen by reality. For 12 years, Nazi leaders had projected strength, discipline, and inevitability. They spoke of destiny, racial supremacy, and eternal rule. They believed the world would bend or break before them. Instead, the world had united to destroy them. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler remained hidden beneath Berlin in the surrounded by concrete, maps, and false hope. Above him, Soviet shells slammed into the city. Streets he once paraded through were now battlefields. The Reichstag burned. The capital was falling. Germany would surrender within days. But surrender was not an option for the men who built the regime. They knew what waited for them. The Allied victory meant exposure, trials, judgment, the unveiling of crimes committed across Europe, mass executions, extermination camps, forced labor, starvation, and terror on an industrial scale. The myth of the Nazi state could not survive daylight, and so, as defeat became unavoidable, each leader faced the same question: how do you end a life built on absolute power? Some chose death over capture. Some chose poison over trial. Some chose silence. Some chose fire. And some lived long enough to watch their world disappear, piece by piece. There would be no single ending. Unlike the empire they tried to build, their deaths would not be unified or glorious. Each man met a different fate shaped by fear, desperation, and the reality they had spent years denying. The Allies advanced not just with tanks and planes, but with evidence. As camps were liberated, the truth spilled out in photographs, documents, and survivors' voices. The scale of Nazi crimes shocked even hardened soldiers. There would be no hiding from what had been done. For Nazi leaders, this knowledge was unbearable. Adolf Hitler, the symbol of the regime, knew capture would turn him into a trophy. Heinrich Himmler understood that the architect of mass murder would receive no mercy. Joseph Goebbels knew his words could no longer rewrite reality. Hermann Göring knew his rank would not protect him in a courtroom. Rudolf Hess knew history had already abandoned him. The illusion of control vanished. Power once enforced through tyranny, nothing without an army to back it. Loyalty evaporated. High-ranking officials fled, betrayed one another, or disappeared entirely. The same system that demanded obedience now devoured its creators. As Germany collapsed, Nazi leaders scattered like shadows. Some hid behind false names. Some tried to negotiate with enemies they once mocked. Some locked themselves underground, clinging to ideology while the world burned above them. And yet, none escaped the ending. Within weeks, the Third Reich officially ceased to exist. Germany surrendered unconditionally in May 1945. The Nazi flag was torn down. Allied soldiers marched through the ruins of Berlin. The war in Europe was over. But for the men who led Nazi Germany, the end of the war was only the beginning of something worse. Justice was coming. Revenge was coming. History was coming. Faced with that reality, each leader made a final choice, one that revealed who they truly were when stripped of power. Some died instantly. Some delayed the inevitable. Some left behind questions that would echo for decades. Their endings were not heroic. They were not cinematic victories. They were desperate, lonely, and often cowardly. This is what happens when an empire built on fear collapses, and in the moments that followed inside bunkers, prison cells, and guarded rooms, the most powerful Nazis met their fate in ways no propaganda poster ever imagined. What happened next shocked the world. By April 1945, Adolf Hitler was already living among ghosts. He no longer ruled from grand halls or towering podiums. The man who once commanded Europe now existed beneath its sealed, inside the Führerbunker, a reinforced concrete shelter buried under the ruins of Berlin. Above him, the city was dying. Soviet artillery pounded Berlin day and night. Each explosion sent tremors through the bunker walls. Maps were outdated within hours. Streets that still existed in the morning were battlefields by nightfall. The Red Army was less than a mile away. The war was over. Hitler refused to admit it. Inside the bunker, the air was stale and heavy with smoke, sweat, and fear. Electric lights flickered. Officers whispered. Secretaries cried. The once disciplined structure of Nazi command had collapsed into confusion and denial. Hitler himself was a shadow of the figure known to the world. He was 56 years old but looked far older. His hands shook uncontrollably. His back was bent. His face was pale and rigid, drained by years of stress, illness, and drugs, prescribed by his personal physician. The fiery speaker who once hypnotized crowds could barely raise his voice. Still, he clung to fantasy. He spoke of non-existent armies coming to rescue Berlin. He blamed generals, traitors, and conspiracies. Anyone but himself. Reality had become unbearable. On April 29, 1945, with Soviet forces fighting street by street above, Hitler made his final preparations. That night, he married Eva Braun, his longtime companion, in a brief civil ceremony inside the bunker. There was no celebration, no music, no guests, only a small group of witnesses, a document, and the understanding that this was not a beginning but an ending. Afterward, Hitler dictated his last will and political testament. In it, he blamed the Jews for the war. He expelled former allies. He appointed successors who would never rule. Even at the edge of death, he refused responsibility. The next morning, April 30th, 1945, the bunker was silent. At approximately 3:30 p.m., Adolf Hitler said goodbye to his staff. There were no speeches, no dramatic farewell, just brief nods and forced composure. He then retreated with Eva Braun into his private room. What happened next was known only to the dead. But the evidence left behind would tell the story. Hitler had made his decision long before. He would not be captured. He would not be paraded through Moscow. He would not stand trial. On the small table beside him lay a cyanide capsule tested earlier on his dog to ensure it worked. In his hand, a pistol. Eva Braun bit into a cyanide capsule and died almost instantly. Hitler followed moments later. He bit down on cyanide and simultaneously shot himself in the head. The sound was dull, final, unmistakable. When aides entered the room, they found the bodies exactly as Hitler had ordered they would. Eva Braun lay lifeless on the sofa. Hitler slumped forward, blood staining the carpet. The leader of Nazi Germany was dead, but even in death, Hitler feared humiliation. For years, he had obsessed over the fate of Benito Mussolini, whose body had been displayed and abused by Italian partisans. Hitler would not allow the same. He had given strict instructions. His body was to be destroyed. Within minutes, his aides carried both bodies up through the Bunker S emergency exit into the shattered garden of the Reich Chancellery. Shells exploded nearby as Soviet troops closed in. Under constant fire, they placed the corpses in a shell crater. They poured gasoline over the bodies, and then they set them on fire. Flames rose into the gray Berlin sky. The final image of the man who sought to rule the world was not one of power but of burning flesh amid rubble and defeat. The bodies were only partially destroyed. Later, Soviet forces recovered the remains and identified them through dental records. The myth of Hitler's survival would linger for decades, but history was clear. Adolf Hitler was dead. No final battle. No martyr's death. No heroic stand. Only suicide hidden underground while his empire collapsed above him. The Third Reich did not end with a roar. It ended with a gunshot in a bunker. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed Hitler as invincible, chosen by destiny, protected by fate. But fate did not save him. Ideology did not save him. Loyalty did not save him. When reality arrived, he chose escape over accountability. And with that single act, the illusion shattered. Germany surrendered days later. The war in Europe was over. But Hitler's death was only the beginning of the Nazi leadership's downfall. Others would follow, each meeting an end shaped by fear, desperation, and the consequences of their crimes. This was how the most powerful man in Nazi Germany met his end, and the rest would not be much different.